Okay, we're going to finish off this whole chunk with looking at sort of current sort of social political crisis in the region. There's actually two of these, but they revolve around the same type of issues, and it has to do, again, not surprisingly, with history, or more accurately, how people interpret history. And the key player in both of these, sort of related crises is the People's Republic of China, the big China. Now, the relationship China has with its neighbors has always been ambivalent. This goes back, hundreds, if not thousands of years. As I was talking about last time, the interesting thing about that is, of course, there really wasn't a lot of interest in the world outside of China by the Chinese governments because they weren't really interested in stuff on the ocean. They were much more concerned about things that actually were land-based. So they're much more worried about, for example, Mongolia than they were, say, Korea or say, Japan or the Philippines or something. So in that context, there was things that were directly accessible that were a main concern. That changed with the People's Republic, and when the People's Republic comes into power in 1949, so modern China. Initially, they're essentially sort of a pariah. When China is founded because it's a communist republic and it's seen as having links to the Soviet Union, which it did, then immediately, almost everyone else in the region doesn't want anything to do with them because they're part of this whole sort of Euro-American anti-communist thing. So basically, China has to survive on its own resources. This changes finally when China opens up in the late 1970s, early 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, and starts to get involved in the world order, and very quickly, as it is now, becomes the dominant production base for the entire globe. In that context, initially, again, they're not really worried about the area around them. Because, for example, initially, all the stuff that was made in China was shipped on Korean and Japanese vessels. So the Koreans and the Japanese were the ones moving the Chinese goods around. By the 1990s, that changes, and as China starts to get the idea, well, we can make even more money if we not only make this stuff, but we move it around. So you start to get Chinese shipping companies, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, sort of the fly in all this ointment is the fact that during this entire period, Taiwan is the Republic of China, since that's the government that lost mainland China, still its own independent country here. And of course, to China, this should be part of us. So in that context, what you get is more and more China starts to pay attention to the water, which is probably one of the first times in Chinese history outside of the early Ming Dynasty they did that. And in that process, the other thing that then sort of turns the heat up in this whole situation is the fact that one, as we're talking about in West Asia, is the global energy crisis. The amount of fossil fuels are disappearing as countries become more industrialized, as countries become more financially and socially stable, China being a classic example. Then one of the first things you do is you start increasing your energy consumption. China went from basically having almost no cars. And I remember the first time I was there 20 something years ago, private automobiles were pretty much non-existent. You had taxis and stuff, but except for folks who are pretty powerful, you didn't see a lot of cars around. If you go into major cities now, it's like being in LA or Honolulu. It's just permanent traffic jams all over the place. Everyone's got a car, even if they don't know why they need it. And it's just insane. That's in the space literally of 20 years. So China has become this enormous consumer of gas and all sorts of other fossil fuels. Along with that, of course, is the pressure to cut down the amount of coal, which is what China traditionally used. So the end result of all this is China has become this enormous consumer of resources, especially oils and such. And of course, that largely came from the Middle East or, say, the North Sea region. And so, they got a lot from Russia and from England and from, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. But in the process of looking for where more of this was, because everyone was aware even 40, 50 years ago that there's finite resources in the oil fields that exist. And so what happened was everyone started looking, and in that process realized that there's large oil and natural gas reserves in both the South China Sea and in this part of the East China Sea. No one's really too sure how much. Just because no one will share information, but also just because I don't think anyone knows. So geology isn't that much of a science. But then nonetheless, it's a lot. And for the countries around here, Japan is highly industrialized, South Korea is highly industrialized, Taiwan is highly industrialized. Of course, China now is uber industrialized. Philippines is trying to get there. For all of these countries, suddenly having oil parked on your doorstep, and natural gas even more so, is hugely attractive because it means you won't have to buy it from somewhere else. And not only can you have it for your own use, but if you've got surpluses, you can sell it to other folks. So basically, all these countries start to visualize themselves as like the newest, Mark III version of Saudi Arabia. The problem is, if you look at these two areas, they're not areas which belong to someone. They are areas which are shared by a bunch of bordered regions. And the law of the sea, which went into place in the 1980s, basically said that every country controls the economic resources within 200 miles of its coastline. Well, the problem you get is, of course, in the case of Taiwan, is Taiwan and mainland China are only about 45 miles apart. It's about half again more than, say, from Molokai to Oahu. But it isn't exactly a huge chunk of territory. And it also means that 200 miles, like, what's that mean? If you look over here, the 200-mile boundary would be right about here, which means that Vietnam and China, since Hainan's part of China, they both share this. The boundary runs this way. So it means if you're talking about the oil resources here, you basically have Brunei, you have the Indonesian territory, you have the Malaysian region up here, Vietnam, even to a certain extent Cambodia, the Philippines, China, all have equally legitimate claims to basically, looking for oil here and collecting oil. And, if this was an area where people got along a little better, then they would just share. They just say, well, okay, you're China, you get 40%, Philippines gets 10% or whatever. But no one likes share, especially when you think of oil. It's like winning a lottery. You don't want to share it. In the East China, it's of course exactly the same. You've got Taiwan, you've got China, South Korea, Japan, all have claims to this oil, which is right about here. And they're all equally legal claims. Now, they were going through negotiations, and there was, for a while, it looked like they were going to get this sort of sorted out. And then as China changed political attitudes in the last 10 years, especially under Xi Jinping, the current leader, what happened was they decided they weren't going to negotiate anymore. China has decided that, just like Putin's Russia, that they're large enough they don't have to do deals and they don't have to listen to anyone. What they're going to do is they're going to tell the world what they're going to do, and the rest of the world's going to go, okay, fine, do it. And this is their new way of looking at stuff. And this has become this is actually much more of a hot point than the Ukraine. And it's sort of tied to two things. One is China just formally, again, this last General Secretary's Party meeting, which is their version of sort of a State of the Union address. Xi Jinping said that they're going to take Taiwan back and they're going to do it by force. They're not interested in what Taiwan wants. As far as they're concerned, Taiwan historically has always been part of China, and it's coming back either at gunpoint or by choice. And the Taiwanese are basically saying, when hell freezes over. So they literally got, enormous military forces ready to take Taiwan. In fact, as my comments that I made, I would not be surprised if by the end of March, the war for Taiwan has started. Having everyone distracted by Russia and Ukraine is really useful for the People's Republic of China. But that's not where it stops in their case. What they really want is they want Taiwan, one, because it irritates the hell out of it, isn't part of China. But they also want it because that then gives them this 200-mile area and it gives them a bigger, quote, legitimate, relatively speaking, claim. Back about 10 years ago, they came up that it was older, but it suddenly became a really big issue. They started talking about what they called the 9-dash line, which at least initially no one knew what the hell they were talking about. And what they've done is basically the Chinese government has decided that any place that there were large Chinese populations in the past, this could be the Ming Dynasty 600 years ago, this could be, whoever, is now should be our territory. So wherever Chinese feet stomped around and the Chinese government sort of had at least an interest in the place, all of that now belongs to China. If you want to put it into context, there's real good evidence that you had Vikings, for example, romping around Newfoundland and maybe Maine in North America. And to be like suddenly if Norway or Denmark in 2022 says, well, because there were Vikings there, back, 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, we're now going to take over, Newfoundland and Maine's going to belong to Denmark because we used to have guys there. And everyone's like, what? And it's the same situation here. The Chinese, as I pointed out, have had no interest in the seas. Rather than dealing as partners or, sort of cooperatively, they basically said that, this boundary, which basically runs like this, runs right off the coast of Vietnam, is their 9-dash line. Goes all the way down here to Sarawak, Brunei, comes across here, goes right along the coast of the Philippines, goes not surprisingly here, goes all the way up here, right along the basically bounces off the southern edge of Okinawa, the Ryukyus, which is right here, and goes up here into basically the LC. And that's what they call the 9-dash line. And the Chinese attitude now is everything in the 9-dash line is theirs. They don't have to negotiate. They don't have to ask. They don't have to be nice. They don't have to pay attention to what anyone else wants to do. This is their property. And they've started fortifying islands in the south down here in the Spratly group. Yeah, right here, especially the Paracels down here. They've now got huge fortified bases they built, especially in the last 5 or 6 years. And if you look at these particular islands, you're way the hell far away from China. You're literally this. You've got Indonesia here, you've got the Philippines right here, and then you've got Vietnam here. This has nothing to do with 200 miles. This has basically an arbitrary line drawn by the Chinese, which is theirs. Here's what the line looks like. Let's see if we can switch over here. I think that switched. Wait, let's try this. Okay. Here's just Wikipedia's got a decent discussion of this. Here's the 9-dash line. So it goes right down here, all the way over here. This is Brunei, Sarawak, Palawan. Here's your Philippine main islands, and of course there's Taiwan. And the Chinese are basically saying everything in this is theirs because of history. Never mind the fact that the Chinese government never actually claimed this region historically. But they've just decided now, well, since Chinese used to hang around there and used to putt around here, and ironically, those ethnic Chinese enclaves I was talking about last time meant there were Chinese always living around here, then this belongs to us because of that. Never mind the fact that Indonesians have been running around this area for 30,000 years. So if it's longevity, they got you beat by about 29,000 years. But that's not the way the Chinese see it. And this is basically being defined at gunpoint. The Chinese government, the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, which is this huge force, and armed Chinese fishing boats are basically going through all of this area and claiming it, including the islands. They just got into a near shooting conflict with the Philippines a couple of weeks ago. They've been in 3 or 4 shooting conflicts with Vietnam. Malaysia's just about got into a fight with them last week. The Japanese and them in the northern part been doing all sorts of massive, military overflights, just like before the Ukraine war started. So what you've got here is the Chinese basically have said that all this is theirs and it's not subject to negotiation anymore. This gives you an idea that the southern part of this is exactly how complicated it is. Go look at the Wikipedia one if you don't see this, but if you look at this, just all these competing claims, and China's basically just whiteboarded this stuff and said, we don't care what the competing claims with. All of this is ours because we've decided it's ours. This is the H line here, which just happens to include all the oil and gas reserves in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, just of course accidentally. This is actually currently considered by Stratfor and most folks as being the largest flashpoint on the planet, because all these countries need these particular reserves. These reserves are in short supply. None of these countries have these reserves currently. So having access to your own gas and oil would not only make them independent energy-wise, but also make them into oil, producers. And so they could all basically use all the oil. But in most cases, they're willing to share. But now that China has basically arbitrarily said, well, you guys aren't allowed in this area, it belongs to us. This has gotten really, really complicated. US naval vessels from here, from Honolulu, every week or so come sailing right through the middle of this for the purpose of basically just, telling the Chinese you can't do this, and, just sort of poking them with a stick, which isn't necessarily a good thing to do, especially with the Chinese right now. But nonetheless, that's the state of affairs. Now, of course, where it gets very complicated, even more complicated way, is that, of course, if you look at these 2 regions, if you're China as the world's great production center, and you make a large part of what people buy at Target or a Walmart or any place like that, then all that stuff basically gets shipped out through these 2 seas. And this is why the United States and the Europeans and everyone, the Europeans just sent a naval contingent out here a couple of months ago to go puttering around down here, just to tell the Chinese you cannot control these particular areas and make them into your sovereign territory because they're part of the open sea and everyone needs to have access to them so they can move stuff in and out of China. And so, that's why this is seen as the great flashpoint. Not only does this have natural gas and oil reserves here, but also would allow China to basically monopolize control of goods and resources from their production base to the rest of the planet. it would, of course, immediately almost, without definition, just sort of shut down the other countries around it. Japan could probably survive, but the Philippines would just cease to exist because it would basically everything would be controlled by China. So for the countries in Southeast Asia, the 9-dash line is an enormous threat. Vietnam, Philippines most specifically, but all the region, because they see this as one, it's totally unwarranted Chinese aggression rather than just sort of doing a deal. And secondly, you have to remember that they have a history of not getting along with the Chinese just by virtue of the ethnic Chinese in their own borders. So they're not happy to suddenly see this new sort of nightmare show up when they finally come to sort of grips with the Chinese ethnicity in Southeast Asia. Now you've got the Chinese government, which is also the world's largest military, and now the second, if not, in fact, I think it's now the world's largest navy, suddenly dictating terms for this whole section of the world. And so that's why, if you're looking at places that are running at a really high temperature and the temperature's going up, this is the biggest one on the planet, is the Chinese, the 9-dash line, and their unwillingness to negotiate. They just, it is. And, everyone keeps on almost pressing buttons. And of course, then that folds into also the Chinese attitude towards Taiwan. So it's all become sort of a big package. And the current assessment of people that do these type of forecasting is that China is not going to let this last for more than another couple of months. They're going to try to resolve it. And it's very possible they're going to see what happens with Russia and the Ukraine before they do that, just to figure out what the world's response is going to be. But I'm not sure that they really care. So we'll see how this all plays out. But it's not exactly a good case of the warm and fuzzies.